Hello everybody, welcome to the RamblingReverend, and for this episode I actually want to talk about some, I guess, philosophical things, but it's more rambling than anything, and it might give everybody a, a scary look into my brain or an amusing one. So, in college, I think I've said this a few times before on these podcasts, I did a couple deep dives into a few things. And evidently, it's not uncommon whenever you're doing an intense schooling for you to do some sort of outlet that is not what you're intensely focusing on. And so, whenever I was in the middle of all the intense Greek work at Moody, I remember I did two things. One, I binge watched all of the animated series Gargoyles. And if you haven't seen Gargoyles, it either means you're way too young or way too old. It was a very well done cartoon in the 90s and 2000s. And like the more I think back on it, like there was a lot of use of Greek and Hebrew names and Latin. Like it was well done with folks. But the other thing I did a really big deep dive into was Bigfoot. Now, I can't remember why I did the first dive into Bigfoot, but I discovered there's a website called BigfootResearchOrganization.net, so BFRO.net. And it was funny because you could look up Bigfoot sightings by county. So you can zero in by state and by county. And looking up all these different areas, and I had a hypothesis that areas with low education, high alcohol use, and high drug use is usually where you'd see a lot of these, and that played out a little bit, but not surprisingly, a lot of the Bigfoot sightings are actually more so just large wooded areas. And I developed over the next few years a curiosity around Bigfoot, and I kind of want to dig into that, but with the parallel thought of what kind of presuppositions do you have, or what do you already believe to be true? And I mention this because I wanted to actually develop a survey to send out to everyone who's an official member of BFRO. Now, not everyone, it's a public access website, and there's categories of Bigfoot sightings, Class A, Class B, Class C, whether or not it's actual, like you see it, how close you see it, if you hear it, all these other things. And so as I'm doing my deep dive into Bigfoot stuff, my question that I kept on asking is, what are the alternative answers for who Bigfoot is, or what Bigfoot is? And you would not probably think about how many different guesses there is for who or what Bigfoot is. Now, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti would be overlapping terms that probably have more of a regional type use. And I actually just heard a newer, hopefully everyone likes my mugs, just heard a newer name that was more of a West Virginia type, Kentucky regional name for Bigfoot. But anyhow, as I'm looking into Bigfoot, I kept on asking the question, what could explain a Bigfoot? And then also, why don't people believe that Bigfoot could exist? Now, the why people believe Bigfoot couldn't exist, I think, is a just interesting philosophical question to dive into from a standpoint of someone who is a evangelical Christian who believes in miracles and who believes God can supernaturally act, and who believes that the Bible does record giants and some pretty amazing acts. Now, I state that because when you approach a concept of a Bigfoot, there is, which I think is actually Gigantopithecus is whatever some people would call him that. All these other things, which we'll wait to talk about more explanations for who or what a Bigfoot is. From a purely naturalist, evolutionary science standpoint, I would ask the question, why do you believe that there is a creature that can't exist? So if you were to track along, the supposed biology, why couldn't a large mammal exist that is in such and such a manner? Now, the accusations usually levied against a Bigfoot existing is that, well, we don't have any definitive remains, and you would have thought that we'd have had actual sightings. We have too many people, too many satellites, too many everything else. And there are some more current people who are, FBI trained, heat cameras, dogs that can smell stuff, that say, look, if we had found it, we'd be able to track it down by now. Now, I go back and I think, if that's the case, what would be alternative answers to, instead of this being some, whatever, what could it be? So I want to just quick walk through different scientific ways that a Bigfoot could have existed or could exist. Now, in the southeast, so specifically in Florida, there's a lot of reportings of a Bigfoot that is most likely an ape or a chimpanzee, some sort of primate that was an exotic pet that escaped and is living down there, and because it is not native to that area, it doesn't have any other anything to mate with, that it's going to be a solitary animal, and it's going to interact differently with people, and so that would explain the Bigfoot sightings is just actually a primate. Other possible explanations for Bigfoot that I thought were really interesting as I've looked at all this stuff is, so there is in Canada, we still have some indigenous tribes that practice forms of shamanism, and a shaman would typically leave their tribe, be solitary, and the goal is to be at one with nature, and so they would not have any clothing that would have been made of animals, and they would probably have used things like moss and leaves and tried to make a makeshift coating over themselves, so something that would have probably looked like hair from a distance. And because of them being shamans, they interact and are different, and so their mannerisms would have not been considered human, and would not have been considered ape-like. So that would have been a possibility there for a lot of the Bigfoot sightings in Canada. And then something that I've thought about a little bit is there's a disorder, I think it's called hypotrichia, where you have an excessive amount of hair on your body. And if you look it up, this is it's well recorded and well reported that we'd have multiple instances where people have their body fully covered in hair. You think about if you're in a society that thinks that is a negative thing or a negative sign, you're going to get pushed out and expelled. So those are some answers for some of the Bigfoot type stuff. What that doesn't answer is, why would someone think that it's 9 foot to 12 foot tall? It doesn't explain the feet being big, doesn't explain how quickly the animal can move, all that other stuff. So there's folks who have actually levied the guess. Now, I'm not putting this as a actual possibility, that Bigfoot is actually an interdimensional being who can teleport. Now, that is an amusing thought or possibility, and this is where you start to enter into all these sort of weird guesses as to what a Bigfoot could be. And there are people who think that Bigfoot is the missing link. There's people who would say we have the evidence, it's just being covered up. And ironically, so I researched and I was looking, who are people who have PhDs who believe that a Bigfoot could exist? And there are no known or credible PhD in biology that would hold to a Bigfoot existing, but there's people who are PhD anthropologists who believe that Bigfoot could exist, which again would go down and say, well, what could this be? Now, I'm sure you could find someone who would say, look, you have Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, and you have then the Book of Enoch with this explanation that explains the XYZ, so therefore Bigfoot actually is a weird hybrid of sorts that explains the speed and the strength and the size. So all that back to the original question of presuppositions. What do you believe can be true can often determine what you believe is true. And I point this out because whenever you have conversations with people, and this is mostly, I want you to be self-reflecting whenever you have conversations with people. When you approach a conversation, do you approach a conversation to convince the other person to change their mind, or do you approach the conversation with an open mind? Now, obviously, whenever you're talking about Bigfoot, it's different than whether or not you're talking about what is truth, right or wrong. Did you make a mistake? What's a better process of making a better water bottle that's more environmentally friendly for the world? So all these things, I go back to the question of what do you presuppose? What do you believe is true? And in biblical terms, this would be like, what's your hermeneutic? So what's the lens by which you study and interpret things? And a lot of us believe that we carry no presuppositions. We carry no pre-existing lens by which we interact with the world. And we say that person has, a pre-existing lens, but I don't. This is super evident and obvious in the political world where every administration, you have a group of people that will fight and argue that the person in power is wicked and terrible, and then their person that they voted for the next time is in office, the exact same political turmoil happens, and they point blame, well, it can't be my person, it's the other person. So there's a presupposition that you see, and it's usually Facebook posts where this person is not wanting to approach the conversation with actual conversing. They're lecturing, they're pointing fingers, they're finger wagging, they're just angrily talking about stuff. And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying all ideas are equal in all spheres and all time. But the question that I'm asking is, do we acknowledge our presuppositions, and do we acknowledge our belief system that we're going into something with? Because I think we miss a lot whenever we don't acknowledge that we have a pre-existing value or belief system. And I'm working my way through C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, and I think this is part of what he's getting to in only 5 chapters in or 6 chapters in. But we have pre-existing beliefs on a lot of things, and a lot of that is human nature, a lot of that is then also the environment that you're in. And so I found, though, that so often we need to clear the table, metaphorically, and ask, what do I believe and why? I did this whenever I got into seminary, where I said, and now I'm going to point out a presupposition in my statement. I said, God, I take all my beliefs and I want to actually put them before you. And after 4 years of study, I only want to believe what is actually in the scriptures and not just something that's handed down to me. Now, in that prayer itself, I'm presupposing an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God who communicates and who relates to his creatures. So I am, presupposing a relationship that I have with him that isn't something else. So obviously there's presuppositions in that prayer itself. But I did this because I'm like, I'm training to be a pastor at that point, and I'm like, I want to make sure that if I'm teaching something, I'm not just teaching something that is handed to me, that was handed to that person, that was handed to that person, that was handed to that person. Oh, you can go down the infinite chasm recess and say, well, all that. And but are we, as people who live in an age of information, who live with the ability to readily communicate with people, ask yes or no questions, are we able to do this? Now, in the book of James, it says we need to be slow to speak, quick to listen, but slow to anger. Where so often in the political discourse, in the social discourse, it's quick to anger, quick to speak, and slow to listen. Now there's the statement that we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, but 1 mouth, and so therefore that should really come out in how we live and how we practice. And so this is where I go back to just presuppositions. Now, I find the concept of a Bigfoot existing interesting, more so from a human psychology standpoint. I find a hubris whenever humans and humanity believe we already know everything. It's probably 10 or 15 years ago now. Believe it or not, a lot of my last 10 to 15 years is compressed in my memory bank. But I remember finding out that there was for the first time ever, a mammal in the mountains of China that had been photographed. People had said this animal exists, and people knew of it, talked about it, but people were like, "There's no way this animal exists because we don't have evidence." And we finally have a picture of it. Now it's a small animal. It's definitely not a Bigfoot, but it just made me think. We have in Chinese written history going back millennia. Like, it is a very well documented multiple empires and emperors, and someone would still doubt whether or not this animal existed until they saw a picture. And your confidence as to what is evidence also depends on who you're talking to. And so in my brain, I'm thinking, if we have 80% of the ocean that we really know nothing about, whenever we're really honest about it. Like, we have all these national oceanic explorations and endeavors that are searching out the ocean bottom, and I'm like, okay, that we admit we don't know everything about the ocean floor, but we think, well, I already know everything about the surface of this planet, and I'm like, hold on, that is a very strong statement. And now I'll put my cards on the table. Nothing in my belief system says Bigfoot has to exist or can't exist. My biggest objection to the whole conversation is saying that we know something for sure about this world because we've already figured it out. How many times have we encountered where people say, I've got it all figured out, but they didn't? There's an archaeologist, his last name's Ramsay, and he was like, look, all this stuff about Jesus and the Bible and the New Testament, like this whole guessing over the archaeology of all these cities, it obviously can't be true. We would know it. And then he set out to kind of like disprove it, and then he discovered the actual sites by digging and finding out. It wasn't any sort of like hidden, but it took effort. Now, what does this have to do with Bigfoot? Am I saying people need to believe in Bigfoot? Absolutely not. I think that statement in and of itself is ludicrous. Because I personally would say then that the evidences for Bigfoot don't necessitate a belief in it. But I think if you were to look at a lot of life, a lot of areas, if you were to go, there's a website called Skeptics. It's actually talking about people who had a skepticism about the Christian faith, and they dug into it. You have people who are scientists, you have people who are mathematicians, you have people who are journalists, and you have people who were, ex-lawyers and judges, where they examine the evidences for the faith that someone claims, and they go through it, and they're like, wow, the evidence is actually really strong. It should necessitate a belief. And so oftentimes what I think happens inside of Christian circles like I run in, where we don't want to talk about weird things that we believe because we don't want to sound crazy in one thing that we think that has little evidence, whenever to the world the evidences for Christianity seem just as weird. So a claim in a supernatural event or a paranormal event or anything else, it's not one-to-one. Those things are not all equal. But if one person presupposes none of that can be true, and they talk to someone who presupposes that one of those things could be true, their presuppositions are clashing in that conversation. Now that sounds super deep and super, philosophical, but think about it. If you believe that there can be nothing that exists that can't be explained outside of the laws of science and nature, and someone explains something very small that in their brain it fits well within the realm of what could be normal inside of life, it's going to be a clash. It doesn't matter. And so this is one of those weird sort of ramblings where it's like, hopefully people aren't thinking I'm a crazy person who believes in every which thing. I want us to each individually ask, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? And whenever we have a conversation with someone else, are we willing to actually look at the evidences of what they're saying for what they believe? And are we willing to let our presuppositions be exposed to the light? Because so often, I know I do this, I get very defensive if someone were to point out that I'm presupposing something. And it's better to just embrace that truth that we might presuppose something and then have a conversation about it. And be willing to be proved wrong, because it is pointless to hold on to something that is proved wrong, right? Because we need to grow and learn. So this is my rambling. Very different than my normal running stories or basketball stories or other things like that. If you knew me in high school or college, you'll know that I enjoy Bigfoot. Oh yeah, I wanted to point out my girls. Part of the reason why I enjoy Bigfoot stuff is it gives my girls something to laugh about and to say like, oh, this is Dad. Dad likes this, and you can get the funny Bigfoot books or whatever from the library. I think there's a Yeti and Unicorn children's book series that's amusing. All that to say, so like. It's more of a joke than anything at this point for me, because I can't invest a lot of time and energy into it. I don't want to invest a lot of time and energy into looking into Bigfoot stuff instead of spending time with my family or going for a run or other stuff like that. But so hopefully you enjoyed this. We'll see. It's definitely a rambling and. But I think it's just an amusing little connection point of Bigfoot to launch into ideas of presuppositions and what do we believe can and is true.